The desert sun was low and bleeding gold across the horizon, casting long, trembling shadows over the rocky canyon. Dust hung heavy in the air, curling in lazy spirals around the jagged cliffs. A lone figure knelt on the parched earth, wrists bound by rough rope that cut into the skin. His chest rose in quick, shallow gasps as he tried to push himself upright, but the ropes held him fast. "Please, I beg you, untie me," he whispered, voice trembling, almost swallowed by the wind. His eyes darted upward, catching a figure standing perfectly still at the canyon's edge, a warrior, whose gaze was as unyielding as the mountains themselves. The Apache warrior had a presence that made the air seem thicker, heavier, as if even the wind respected his silence. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, yet tonight there was something different. The usual fire of tribal tradition, the codes that dictated mercy and honor, had not touched him. The bound man tried to read the warrior's expression, searching for a flicker of sympathy. A hint of hesitation, anything that could promise freedom. But the warrior's eyes were storm clouds, dark and unreadable. The man's name was Talana, young scout with a quick mind but a reckless streak that had led him into this trap. He had grown up hearing stories of the Apache, of their honor and unbreakable codes, yet now, faced with one of their fiercest sons, he understood how little he truly knew. The desert whispered around him, carrying faint cries of hawks above and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. Every sound seemed amplified, echoing the tension between hunter and prey. Talon's thoughts raced as he considered his choices. He could remain pleading, hoping the warrior would remember the codes of mercy taught by elders long gone, or he could stop speaking altogether, stilling himself like the silent statues carved in the rock walls around them, and hope that patience would buy him something. But deep down he feared that silence would mean nothing tonight. This was no ordinary encounter. The Apache warrior, named Red Hawk, had seen countless conflicts in his lifetime. Yet something about Talon stirred an unfamiliar reckoning in him. The warrior's silence was not born from cruelty alone. It was a test, a puzzle, a moment where past and present collided. Red Hawk's tribe had lived by tradition for generations, every action measured, every word weighted with purpose. To break that tradition now was unthinkable, yet he remained motionless, holding a decision that could tip life and death on its fragile scale. Talon's eyes shifted to the landscape, scanning for escape. The canyon's walls rose high on either side, jagged teeth of stone that promised no hiding place.
Ow.
The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, of smoke from a distant fire, but no help came. Every instinct screamed to run, to fight, to demand release, yet he remained bound. He felt the sting of the ropes, the roughness of the earth beneath his knees, and an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with fear alone. Red Hawk took a step forward, boots crunching against the stones, and Talon flinched. The warrior's shadow stretched long across the desert floor, folding around him like the wings of some dark bird. "You should not have come here," Red Hawk said finally, his voice low and steady, breaking the desert's silence like a blade. There was no anger, only the weight of inevitability, of a fate carved in the same desert stone that surrounded them. Words caught, lost in the vast emptiness. Memories surged unbidden. Talon thought of the last campfire he had shared with his companions. Laughter echoing in the night air, tales of frontier adventures told with reckless pride. He remembered the warnings whispered by elders. The stories of warriors like Red Hawk, who moved like shadows and struck like lightning, realized too late that bravery without understanding was only a spark that could not withstand the wind of the desert. Red Hawk's eyes never left him. There was a strange calmness in those eyes, as if he carried centuries of history. Battles fought and decisions weighed, all the lives that had passed through the canyon before them. Talon sensed that this silence held a choice not his to make. The ropes that bound him were physical, but the unspoken power of tradition was a far stronger chain. That past stretched into eternity, every heartbeat hammering against the cage of fate. Then the desert seemed to hold its breath. The wind stilled. Even the coyote's distant cry faded into an unnatural quiet. Talon knew that the moment had come when the decision would be revealed. Would the warrior honor some hidden law, or had something shifted in the long memory of his people? A law broken for reasons Talon could not yet understand. The tension coiled around him like a rattlesnake ready to strike, and he realized that the next move Red Hawk's move would determine everything. And then, just as the sun began its slow descent behind the cliffs, casting the canyon in blood-red light, Red Hawk lifted his hand. Talon's breath caught in his throat. For a heartbeat, everything paused. The desert, the wind, even time itself seemed suspended between the two men. Talon had begged, pleaded, and hoped, but now he understood that nothing would come easily, and that the silence of the Apache warrior carried more meaning than any words ever could. The ropes dug deeper, the shadows grew longer, and the canyon seemed to close in. Talon's fate rested in the hands of a man who had broken tradition before him, yet had not yet decided if mercy or vengeance would prevail. He could only wait, heart pounding, as the desert held its secret. The canyon seemed endless, stretching like an open wound under the dying sun. Yet Talon could feel the weight of history pressing against him from every rock and crevice. He tried to steady his breathing, though each inhale brought only more heat and more dust into his lungs. Memories of his journey here flickered in his mind like sparks in the dark, warning signs he had ignored. Weeks ago, he had heard whispers of Red Hawk's territory, stories passed quietly by travelers who had skirted the edges of the Apache lands. They spoke of a warrior who moved without sound, whose decisions were absolute, whose silence was as feared as any drawn weapon. At the time, Talon had scoffed, calling it superstition, arrogance, or both. Now, kneeling in the sand with ropes biting into his skin, he understood the gravity of those tales. Red Hawk remained motionless, the fading sunlight glinting off his dark hair and painted face. There was a fire in those eyes, but not the kind that burned recklessly. It was a calculated, patient flame. Talon had seen warriors in battle, men who fought with fury and cried for blood, but Red Hawk carried something older, something carved by generations. Talon realized this man's power did not come from strength alone, but from an understanding of people, of fear, and of the desert itself. He could sense the silent rules that guided Red Hawk's every step, rules older than the borders Talon had crossed, older than the towns and railroads spreading like veins across the land. Talon's mind drifted to his companions, a small group of scouts who had ventured too far, too recklessly. He remembered the council at the fire, the maps spread on the ground, the warnings about trespassing on Apache lands. His pride had been louder than caution, his ambition stronger than fear. Now, those choices echoed in his memory with a painful clarity. His companions were likely miles away, chasing their own fates, and he was alone, the canyon walls pressing in like the pages of a history book he had never wanted to read. Red Hawk shifted slightly, just enough for the movement to catch Talon's eye. The warrior's hand hovered near the quiver at his back, but no arrow was drawn, no motion betrayed impatience. Talon could feel the careful balance of power, the silent test being conducted. He wanted to speak, to explain, to beg for understanding beyond his plea for release. Yet every word felt small, meaningless against the weight of tradition and the quiet authority of the man before him. He wondered what had brought Red Hawk here tonight, standing outside the laws of custom, willing to break the codes that had governed his people for generations. The desert around them began to change, shadows stretching across the sand like dark rivers. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of smoke from a distant fire, a reminder that others moved in the world beyond this canyon. Talon's ears caught faint rustling, the subtle creak of branches, or perhaps something else. The Apache warrior's senses were sharper, and Talon could not help but feel that every whisper of movement was being observed, catalogued, measured. The silence between them carried more than tension. It held questions that Talon could not begin to answer. In that silence, Talon remembered the stories of the Apache people, tales of cunning scouts, of warriors who knew the desert as well as the river knew its course. He thought of the elders' lessons, the warnings about arrogance, and the reverence for life balanced with the necessity of survival. Red Hawk embodied all of it, yet he had chosen to remain quiet, to break tradition in a way that no one outside his tribe would understand. Talon realized that this was more than a confrontation. It was a lesson, a puzzle meant to expose weakness, and perhaps illuminate a truth that Talon had yet to grasp. As the light continued to fade, Talon's hands ached against the rough rope, but his mind began to work more sharply, trying to read the warrior before him. He considered every movement, every shadow that flickered across Red Hawk's face. There was patience in those eyes, a history that went beyond any single battle or dispute. Talon felt the weight of generations pressing down, the unspoken rule that life and death were not always decided by the strength of an arm or the speed of a weapon, but by understanding, respect, and fear, tempered with wisdom. Red Hawk's gaze finally shifted just enough to meet Talon's fully. There was no warmth, no malice, only a quiet observation, as if he were measuring the young scout's soul. Talon shivered, though not from cold. He felt naked under that scrutiny, every flaw, every impulsive choice laid bare. He thought of the paths he had taken, the reckless decisions, and the pride that had brought him to this place. The canyon held its breath with him, every rock, every shadow, and every gust of wind holding its secret as tightly as Red Hawk held his judgment. And yet, beneath the fear, Talon felt a strange flicker of hope. Perhaps the silence was not only a threat, but also an invitation, a chance to prove something beyond mere survival. Perhaps if he could read the warrior's mind, if he could understand the ancient codes, he could find a way to earn mercy. But he also knew that one wrong move, one thoughtless word, could end everything. The desert did not forgive mistakes easily, and neither did Red Hawk. As darkness began to crawl across the canyon, swallowing the gold and red of sunset, Talon realized that the night would bring no answers, only more questions. Red Hawk remained unmoving, a shadow carved in the fading light, and Talon's fate hung precariously between the past and the present, between tradition and the unknown choice of a warrior who had already broken the rules. The ropes cut deeper into his wrists, and the silence stretched longer, each heartbeat marking time until the next move would come. Talon swallowed hard, his voice failing him even as his mind raced. The desert had closed in, the canyon walls towering and unyielding, yet in that vast emptiness, a story was unfolding, older than him, older than the frontier, and he was at the center of it. Red Hawk had broken tradition, but the reason remained hidden, and Talon understood that nothing in the coming night would be simple or safe. The tension, like the desert heat, pressed in from all sides, and he knew the first chapter of this trial was only beginning. Talon felt the night press down on him like a heavy blanket, the canyon walls swallowing the last traces of sunlight and turning every shadow into a shape that could hold death. The ropes bit into his wrists, each movement sending sharp reminders of his helplessness. Yet even as fear gripped him, his mind refused to settle. There was more at stake here than escape. Red Hawk had broken tradition, and that choice whispered of secrets, of old grudges, and of paths Talon could not yet see. Every instinct screamed that this encounter was about more than punishment. It was about something deeper, something that had been waiting in the desert long before he arrived. Red Hawk stood still, silent as the stones, yet his presence dominated the canyon. Talon tried to imagine what was going through the warrior's mind. Was he testing him, judging him? Or was there another force, something older than either of them, guiding his actions? The Apache had always moved with purpose, every gesture a story, every glance a message. Tonight that precision was doubled, tripled, and Talon could feel the weight of history pressing on him. As he knelt there, Talon's thoughts drifted to the river he had crossed earlier that week, to the narrow canyon trails he had chosen in defiance of warnings. He remembered the campfires of his companions, the maps sketched with bold lines, and the reckless laughter that had pushed them into this territory. Every memory now felt like a mistake magnified by the desert, every choice leading him closer to an unknown reckoning. Yet he could not deny that curiosity burned stronger than fear. He wanted to understand Red Hawk's silence, the reason tradition had been broken, the message carried in those dark, unwavering eyes. The wind shifted, brushing across the canyon floor, carrying distant sounds that made Talon flinch. Somewhere, far beyond sight, the whispers of other travelers, other scouts, moved like ghosts across the desert. He wondered if they were aware of the danger that lived in this canyon, of the warrior who moved like a shadow and judged like the desert itself. Red Hawk's gaze never left him unblinking, and Talon realized that the man was not only reading him, he was reading the land, the night, the very threads of fate tangled around them both. Talon's mind turned to the stories he had heard about. Red Hawk. Some said the warrior had been a boy when his village was attacked, that he had survived by cunning and strength, growing into a legend whispered in fear and admiration across the frontier. Others claimed he had a deeper purpose, a mission tied to the land itself, one that required him to bend rules, to break codes, to make choices no one else could understand. Talon had dismissed these stories as exaggeration, but now kneeling in the sand with the desert stretching endless and cold around him, he felt their truth in his bones. For a moment, he let himself imagine the world from Red Hawk's perspective. The warrior had seen life and death in ways Talon could barely comprehend, had weighed honor against survival, and had faced decisions that no man should carry alone. Perhaps breaking tradition was not a sign of weakness or cruelty, but a test one designed not for Talon alone, but for every soul who dared to enter these lands. The thought gave him a strange mixture of fear and awe, a realization that survival might demand understanding, not just action. The canyon floor shifted as a small rock rolled nearby, and Talon flinched, imagining enemies or predators that could be lurking unseen. Red Hawk did not move, yet Talon felt the warrior's awareness in every shift of wind, every faint echo bouncing off the canyon walls. It was as if the warrior were connected to the land in ways Talon could never hope to grasp, and that connection held a judgment that no plea could sway. Talon's thoughts raced, wondering if the ropes were only a small part of the trial, a physical challenge while the real test played out in his mind. In the corner of his vision, Talon caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow flitting across the far cliffs. He could not tell if it was friend or foe, a scout like himself or a coyote stalking prey. Every instinct urged him to cry out, to demand help, to reach for anything that could free him. Yet he understood that noise would only bring more danger. Red Hawk's silence was a command, a boundary, and he had to respect it if he hoped to survive. The desert seemed to hum with tension, every stone and grain of sand aware of the fragile balance between hunter and hunted. Talon's heart hammered as he remembered the warnings of his companions, the legends of Apache warriors who struck without sound and vanished without trace. He realized that his recklessness had brought him here, to a place where the past and present collided, where silence carried meaning heavier than words. And yet, beneath the fear, there was an ember of hope, fragile and stubborn, that maybe understanding the warrior, reading the unspoken rules, could give him a chance to live. Red Hawk shifted slightly, and Talon noticed a change, subtle but undeniable. The warrior's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus, as if weighing unseen forces, considering choices far beyond simple justice. Talon felt the canyon breathe with him, every shadow and stone suspended in anticipation. He knew that what happened next would not only shape his fate, but would ripple beyond this canyon, beyond the desert, touching legacies and stories yet untold. The ropes cut deeper, the night grew colder, and the tension became almost unbearable. Talon's mind raced, trying to guess Red Hawk's thoughts, imagining every possibility, every path to survival or doom. The desert held its secrets tightly, the warrior held his judgment, and Talon understood with a sinking clarity that the night would reveal nothing easily. Every heartbeat echoed with suspense, every shadow seemed alive with intent, and the canyon waited with him, holding the next moment like a secret it would not yet disclose. And so, Talon remained kneeling, bound and exposed, while Red Hawk's silent figure dominated the canyon, a living testament to broken tradition and the weight of history. The night deepened, the air thickened, and the first stars began to blink above. Talon knew the real challenge had only begun, that the desert had more lessons to teach, and that the warrior's choice, still unreadable, still uncertain, would shape not just his fate, but the story of every soul who dared to cross paths with a legend like Red Hawk. The tension hung like the desert wind, endless and unrelenting, and Talon had no choice but to wait, to watch, and to hope that understanding might come before the ropes tore his strength away completely. Talon's muscles burned from the strain of the ropes, yet he could not move, could not look away from Red Hawk. The warrior's shadow stretched long across the canyon floor, mingling with the darkness that crept like a living thing from the cliffs above. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, the silence between them heavier than the ropes that bound him. Talon's mind raced, trying to untangle the mystery of the man before him. How could someone so quiet, so still, carry such power? And why had Red Hawk broken the tradition that had guided his people for generations? The desert seemed to pulse with life, every sound amplified, the distant cry of a coyote, the whisper of wind over sand, the faint rustle of unseen creatures. Talon realized that this canyon was more than a trap. It was a stage, a test set by the warrior and the land itself. Each moment of waiting was a lesson in patience, fear, and understanding. He could almost feel Red Hawk reading him, measuring his thoughts, sensing his panic even before it rose to the surface. The ropes dug deeper, yet the pressure in Talon's chest from anticipation was far greater. Red Hawk stepped forward, his movements deliberate, careful, almost ceremonial. Talon's pulse jumped with every footfall. The warrior's eyes, dark and unyielding, held a depth that Talon could not fathom. There was judgment there, yes, but also something more, an unspoken question, a demand for understanding. Talon's pride fought against his fear, but he knew that neither pleading nor struggle would sway Red Hawk. Only comprehension, only a recognition of the unspoken codes, could hope to survive this encounter. The night air grew colder, carrying the scent of sage and the faint smoke of distant fires. Talon's throat was dry, his skin slick with sweat, despite the chill. Every instinct screamed to act, to free himself, yet he realized that action without thought could destroy him. Red Hawk had mastered the desert, the silence, and the weight of tradition. If he moved too hastily, if he spoke without care, he would only prove the wisdom in the warrior's test. Talon's fear sharpened into focus, every sense straining, every heartbeat counting down the unknown. A sudden gust of wind swept across the canyon, rattling stones and lifting loose sand into a swirling cloud. Talon flinched as the sand stung his face, yet Red Hawk did not move. The warrior's calm in the chaos made Talon's anxiety spike. This was more than a test of courage, was a test of mind and spirit. Talon understood that he had entered a story older than the frontier, one written in the deserts, the cliffs, and the traditions that had endured longer than any man could remember. The weight of history pressed down, making the night seem impossibly vast, and Talon felt the fragility of his own existence in that vastness. For a fleeting moment, Talon thought he saw a shadow flicker behind the warrior, a figure moving along the cliff edge. He blinked, but the desert held its secret, revealing nothing. Was it an enemy, a companion, or another test? The uncertainty gnawed at him, yet he dared not speak, for any sound could disrupt the delicate balance. He was learning, painfully, that survival here required more than strength. It required patience, respect, and insight into forces he barely understood. Red Hawk finally moved again, this time closer, the sand whispering under his boots. His hand hovered near the edge of his bow, though no arrow was drawn. Talon's eyes widened as he realized that even the smallest gesture carried meaning. Every movement was a signal, a question, and perhaps a warning. Talon felt his heart hammering, every nerve alive, every thought focused entirely on reading the warrior, on understanding the unspoken rules of this encounter. The desert itself seemed to lean in, holding its breath with him. Memories of the journey that brought him here surfaced in Talon's mind maps that had led him astray, companions he had abandoned in pursuit of his own curiosity, the reckless confidence that had convinced him he could navigate this land without consequence. Each memory was a sharpened edge, cutting into his pride and forcing him to confront the truth. He was outmatched, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. Red Hawk's silence was a mirror, reflecting everything Talon had ignored, every lesson unlearned, and every choice that had led him to this point. The night deepened further, stars blinking coldly above as if watching the unfolding trial. Talon's breathing slowed, his mind attempting to quiet the storm of fear and panic. Every sound seemed amplified now, the rustle of the desert grass, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind against rock. Red Hawk remained still, a shadow carved into the earth, yet the intensity in his eyes was almost unbearable. Talon realized that the climax of this encounter was near. Every second heightened the stakes, and every breath could be the one that determined life or death. Then, in a silence that seemed absolute, Talon felt something shift in the air. The ropes no longer seemed merely physical. They were part of the story, part of the lesson, part of the tension that had been building since he first entered the canyon. Red Hawk's presence was a question, a challenge, and the desert itself seemed to echo that challenge. Talon's hands trembled, his eyes locked on the warrior, and he knew that the next moments would demand more than courage. They would demand understanding, intuition, and a connection to something older and greater than either of them. Every muscle in Talon's body tensed. The desert wind rose again, carrying dust and distant scents, and Talon felt the raw power of the night pressing in. Red Hawk's silence was no longer merely a test, it was the final stage of the trial. The moment where everything hung in balance, and the story of the canyon, the warrior, and the young scout would collide. Talon's pulse raced, his mind sharp with anticipation, and every fiber of his being screamed that the climax was at hand. The ropes bit, the canyon held its breath, and the warrior's dark eyes promised that whatever happened next would be remembered long after the desert claimed the light. Talon's gaze met Red Hawk's fully, and in that instant he felt a connection beyond words. Tension that was almost unbearable, and yet strangely alive. The night around them seemed to contract, every shadow stretching, every sound silenced in anticipation. The story had reached the edge of its most dangerous moment, and Talon understood with a clarity born of fear and awe that the next move, whether by him or by Red Hawk, would decide more than his fate. It would decide the measure of courage, honor, and understanding between two very different men caught in the timeless embrace of the desert. If you want, I can now write the final 1,000-word section. Where the tension reaches its peak, the mystery of Red Hawk's broken tradition is revealed, and the story moves naturally toward a satisfying and happy ending, while keeping the suspense high until the final resolution. Do you want me to continue with that? Talon's chest heaved as the night air pressed around him. The rope still cutting into his wrists, yet a strange calm settled over him. Red Hawk's shadow loomed close, but the tension that had stretched so unbearably began to shift. The warrior's eyes softened, a flicker of something almost human breaking through the storm of silence. Talon realized in that quiet moment that the test had never been about punishment, nor about power. It had been about understanding, about humility, and about respect for the land and the traditions that shaped it. Red Hawk knelt slowly, the sand crunching softly under his boots. Talon flinched at first, expecting another trial, another test. Yet the warrior's hands moved deliberately, untangling the ropes that had bound him. The knots gave way with careful precision, and the sharp sting of rope marks lingered on Talon's wrists as a reminder of what he had endured. When he finally rubbed the raw skin, his hands trembled not from pain alone, but from the weight of what he had learned. "You came too far," Red Hawk said, voice steady, but carrying a quiet authority. "But you have seen. You have felt. That is worth more than words." Talon swallowed hard, still catching his breath, still trying to process the enormity of the moment. He wanted to ask questions, to explain himself, to beg for mercy again, but Red Hawk's presence was enough to silence him. The warrior had already given him more than mercy, he had given him insight, a chance to see the desert, its people, and himself, in a way he had never imagined. The canyon seemed to exhale as the tension lifted, the wind carrying sand softly across the ground. Talon's gaze wandered to the cliffs above, to the endless desert stretching beyond sight, and he felt a humility he had never known before. Red Hawk rose, tall and imposing even in the pale light of moon and stars. And Talon understood that the warrior's choice to break tradition had been intentional, a lesson wrapped in silence. Sometimes survival required bending rules, reading the world, and understanding forces older than any law or code. Talon's mind returned to his companions, to the reckless pride that had brought him here. He realized how fragile life could be, how easily a single choice could shift the balance between existence and disaster. Yet he also saw the power of respect, of patience, and of listening, not just to words, but to actions, to the land, and to the hearts of those around him. Red Hawk's eyes held a faint smile, a quiet acknowledgement that Talon had survived not only the desert, but also his own arrogance. "Why? Why did you break tradition?" Talon asked finally, voice raw but steady. Red Hawk's gaze met his, and in that moment, the answer was clear, without a single word. Sometimes rules are made to guide, but sometimes the spirit behind them must be judged by circumstance. The warrior's silence had been more than a challenge, it had been an education, a window into the balance between law and wisdom, between fear and understanding. The first light of dawn began to creep over the canyon walls, painting the rocks in gold and crimson. Talon felt the warmth on his face and shoulders, a gentle reminder that life went on, that lessons endured. I sat, and that the desert could be both unforgiving and generous. Red Hawk turned and began to walk toward the distant cliffs, the warrior's presence as commanding and silent as ever, yet with a grace that spoke of ancient understanding. Talon followed, rubbing his wrists, feeling the sting fade, and carrying with him a respect he had never known before. As they reached a ridge overlooking the canyon, Talon looked back at the trail he had traveled, at the shadows that had tested him, and he felt a sense of gratitude. Not only for his own survival, but for the guidance he had received in the form of a silent teacher, a warrior who had chosen to bend tradition for the sake of wisdom. The desert stretched endlessly, but for the first time, it seemed alive with lessons rather than threats. Red Hawk paused, glancing back at Talon with eyes that carried centuries of knowledge. Talon understood that this moment would remain with him forever, a compass for the choices he would face in the future. The desert was vast, the canyon silent, but the bond formed in that night of tension, respect, and courage would endure. Talon knew he would carry it with him, a reminder that understanding and patience were as powerful as strength and skill. For the first time in hours, Talon breathed without fear. The ropes were gone, the threat had passed, and yet the lessons remained. Etched into his mind like the carvings in the canyon walls, the desert had tested him, Red Hawk had taught him, and Talon felt the weight of both challenges as a gift rather than a punishment. He had come seeking survival, but he was leaving with something far greater: respect, humility, and a story that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the sun climbed higher, Talon and Red Hawk moved together along the canyon, two figures bound by the shared experience of night, trial, and revelation. The silence between them was no longer tense but companionable, carrying the understanding of men who had faced fear and learned wisdom. Talon's heart was lighter, his mind sharper, and his spirit steadied. The desert remained vast and wild, but he now knew how to walk in it with eyes open, mind aware, and respect in every step. And so, the canyon held its peace once more, the wind whispering softly over sand and stone, a quiet witness to courage, growth, and the unbroken spirit of those who dared to face the unknown. Talon had survived the night, learned the lessons of the desert, and earned a bond with Red Hawk that would endure beyond the sun, beyond the cliffs, and beyond the stories that would be told in whispers for generations. The ropes were gone, the danger had passed, and the desert had offered its ultimate gift: understanding, wisdom, and hope.